Hello, everyone. Welcome once again. Thank you so much for being here on a Saturday, wherever in the world you may be. Thank you very much for sharing 30 minutes on your weekend with me at NorthStar Solutions and Services. This is episode number 3 of NorthStar Nuggets, which is a 30-minute, once a month dose of future of work oriented wisdom, especially targeted at professionals and leaders who are interested in self led professional development. So today is episode number 3. I'm just going to give it another minute for everyone to settle in, and we'll dive right in. As always, I've shared a link to the content that I'll be sharing today. It's on a Google Drive. I've shared the link to the PDF, and we'll just kind of use that as a signpost for the conversation today. Over the last 2 months, we do North Star Nuggets once a month, and we've dealt with a couple of topics that are very relevant in the context of future of work. So we started off with informational interviews, and then we looked at inclusive leadership. And in continuing with that, today we're going to look at unpacking and understanding unconscious bias. So, having said that, I want to really dive right in. So, the focus for today is to really look at three different aspects of unconscious bias. First of all, what is unconscious bias? And the second thing is, how does it show up at the workplace? And number three, how can we interrupt it and create inclusion and a sense of belonging for our teams and the organizations that we lead? So, first things first. So, like I said, I have shared the link for the content, for today's content in the chat. I'm going to put that link once again. You can click that and follow along. So, what is unconscious bias really? So, the mm, the one thing about it, a fact about it, is that all of us have it. So, it's not just a condition that some of us suffer from. All of us have bias. And the reason for that primarily is the human brain has a capacity to process up to 11 million pieces of information per second unconsciously. So can you imagine the magnitude of that, right? And the human brain is capable of processing only 40 pieces, 40 pieces of information per second consciously. So, given how much the human brain is able to process unconsciously, there's obviously need for some sort of method to the madness, if you will. And that's where these categorizations come in, and we automatically tend to sort of sort and categorize and put information in buckets, if you will. And that's pretty much the basis for unconscious bias. So it's a set of assumptions really that we make of others uh, unconsciously. And sometimes we may be aware of it, but largely we are not. So, for example, if you look at me today, when you first just saw me, I'm sure there were some assumptions that you made in terms of what my ethnicity is, what my language abilities are as far as English is concerned, what my accent might be, and is this the topic that I'm going to talk about? And I'm questioning the abilities and knowledge and skills of people. So these are some things that I'm sure that these thoughts run through your mind, and this is nothing but unconscious bias. That's pretty much it. So the the good news is that everyone has it, but the challenge really still exists is how do we see the impact, and what is the issue with having unconscious bias? It affects all aspects of our lives. We not only do we make assumptions of others, we don't give a chance for people to show who they truly are. We force people to fit into certain stereotypes because of how we expect them to behave, to say, and do things. So those are some of the challenges, and particularly the workplace. It affects hiring. It affects people's ability to progress in their careers. It has an impact on who gets into leadership positions across all levels of leadership. So there's a huge impact, and there's a price we pay for holding on to our unconscious biases. So knowing that everyone has it, all of us have that ingrained in us, there's a lot of value in having that awareness, so that then we can take the next steps of, okay, what does it really look like, and how are we sort of perpetuating that situation, and what can we do to break that cycle. So that's pretty much the focus of the next 20 odd minutes. And if there are questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat, and please feel free to follow along with the PDF document. One of the favorite quotes around unconscious bias and bias in general is, I heard this in a TED talk by Vernā Myers, who's now the VP of Inclusion Strategy at Netflix, that biases are stories you make up about people before you know who they are, who they actually are. And that's the example that I talked about just a few minutes ago. What are some of the stories or assumptions that we make of each other just as soon as we meet someone, even if it's for the first time? So, um, moving on, what does it look like in the workplace? Well, the way it shows up in the workplace is where we make more assumptions than asking questions. So we make assumptions about people, about their situations. We make assumptions about our clients and how we work. There are lots. The other piece that I've seen how it plays out in the workplace, and why understanding unconscious bias is so much more important in the context of future work, is that there's tendency for microaggressions to happen in the workplace. So things such as, for example, I've had the experience where uh, many people, now that I live in the U.S., people would come to me and say, okay, your English is very good. Where did you learn to speak like that? Um, in the beginning, I used to take it as a compliment, and over the years, I've realized that it is actually a form of microaggression, because speaking a language well is not really, in my opinion, a sense of achievement of any sort. So having been at the receiving end of comments like that, or something to the effect of, if somebody finds out which part of the country of India I'm from originally, then to say, oh, you don't look like that. So these are all real microaggressions, because in our brains we have certain patterns and certain stereotypes of how people ought to look, and how they ought to speak, and what kinds of accents they can have, and things like that. So that's the second impact in the workplace that I've seen of holding on to unconscious bias. The other piece that I've seen it is, it leads to a lot of lack of collaboration. And why is that important in the context of future work? Uh, I'm sure all of us are seeing more and more work being done using in teams. Number one, so teamwork is top of the list, and teams are no longer, it's not mandatory for teams to be physically co-located, and especially in the current pandemic and post-pandemic situation, we're seeing that. So teams are more and more uh, geographically distributed, and also by virtue of that, multicultural, really global teams. So not taking the time to check our own biases has a snowballs into a huge price we pay in terms of how we work and the human experience of people at work. Um, so the two earlier points that I made around making assumptions about others, and that leading into some sort of microaggressions, these all play into how the human experience at the workplace is, especially in the context of global teams. How do you get people to collaborate? If we, each of us, holds on to our unconscious biases about others, how do we ever move forward? How do we make progress? Um, and a cascading effect of this that I've seen is lack of employee engagement. How do you build teams, especially as we're moving to a either a completely remote or a hybrid setup, these aspects around building team spirit, making sure team members are engaged across all levels of leadership, bringing about change, managing transformation. These are all the impacts of not checking our own biases and not interrupting them. The last point I wanted to make was it all accounts to the overall human experience, and also what do we achieve at the intersection of people, process, and technology. That's another thing that I often talk about. We 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 tend to quickly come to a conclusion that most problems in the at least in the knowledge work economy can be resolved by using technology. In my experience and in my opinion, technology is only as good as human intent. And so what are our own biases play a big role in how our intent comes out and what is the impact that our intent has. So intent, having good intent always doesn't translate into a positive outcome or a positive impact. So um, at the end of the day, the each of us is unique. Each of us, we bring our whole selves to work, whether we realize it or not, or admit it or not. So understanding our own selves and understanding our own biases and making intentional efforts to interrupt the biases. I think that's important. So if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat box to send them through. I do want to also refer to now, I want to move on to the third point around what are some of the things that we can do to interrupt our own biases. And I also want to spend a few minutes to reflect on this is something you can do in your own time, either right now or later as a self-reflection exercise, is to really think about what are some of the stories that you're making up about people around you. And I'm obviously talking in the context of the work of your workplace. So what are some things that trigger you to build those stories about your colleagues or your leaders or your peers, what they look like, how they speak English, uh, how do they write their emails, what is their tone of voice? Are you taking it for what it is, or are you using them as a scaffolding to build your story about them without giving them the benefit of the doubt or giving them the opportunity to help you check the facts? Yeah. So really think about what stories are you making up. And we do that all the time. You receive an email, there's a reaction, and you've immediately made up a story about the other person, the way they have responded to you or asked you a certain question. You're in a meeting, you get somebody says something, or you're making a point, somebody interrupts you. There's a story right there. Now, it's probably a totally different aspect that we often don't have. We don't pause enough to identify that we are actually making up these stories, and we'll just we carry on because we're so focused on doing the next thing that these stories, before we know it, have taken a life of their own. So it's really important. I invite you to take this time to sort of reflect on what stories are you making up about those around you, because there's absolutely 100% probability that the others are doing the same thing about you. Yeah. The next thing is to think about, how are these stories really serving you? How are they helping you? And 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 the others. So what's the impact that you having these stories about people that you make up, of course, based on some experience of having had interactions with them, but how are these stories really serving you? Yeah. Next, I invite you to think about, how might you replace these stories with facts? So what are some ways in which you can do that? And how important is it to you to do that? So, having said that, I want to now invite you to consider the third aspect of what we started this session with today is how might you interrupt these biases to create an inclusive work environment and create that sense of belonging within the teams that you lead and work with. So I have a quick sort of three-step process, if you will, for that. So here's my submission to you. The next time you end up making up a story about someone, I invite you to do this instead. So in order to replace that story with a fact, go ahead, be proactive, and create that opportunity to create a fact, to discover the fact. So create that opportunity for an actual interaction with the person. And this takes a lot of courage. So let's say there's a disagreement and it came out during a meeting. Instead of creating stories, talking about that person to others, and that's the other aspect, right, of unconscious bias. An indirect output of that is gossip. And we engage in gossip much more than we realize or admit, really. And that has a deep negative impact on the collective productivity and the collective impact that the organization or the team can really create. So taking a step back, checking yourself that that's a story that you've made up about the person, let's go figure out the facts, and creating an opportunity for a true, a genuine human interaction where you allow the other person to help you discover facts about themselves, why they did what they did, why did they say whatever they said during that meeting. But all of this requires a few things. One, our own presence in the moment. Two, our own sense of restraint around not reacting but choosing to respond. And the third thing, all of this requires time. And we often uh, make the mistake of rushing to do the next thing instead of sitting with an experience or an emotion to understand it fully so that you can really move forward and respond instead of reacting. So the first step I would say is whenever you find yourself creating a story about someone else, so in order to realize that you're doing that, you've got to be present with yourself and also be curious about yourself. Um, so James Clear, the author of Atomic Habit, he in his one of his recent newsletters, he talks about thoughts are suggestions. Consider thoughts as suggestions. So don't question your thoughts because they are not the ultimate truth. They are suggestions from that are that your mind is making to you. So question that. Create the opportunity to discover facts about the other person. The next step is to really learn about them and about yourself, to remain curious and continue to learn some more. What do I mean by that? Asking really open-ended questions and taking what I refer to as a coaching stance in your conversations to really understand where this person is coming from. So instead of um, asking close-ended questions like, "Is this what you meant?" where you're putting the other person in a corner really, or not really giving them options to respond, you might want to ask, what did you mean by that? Here's what I understood, but I would like to get a better understanding of what you meant by whatever they said. Let's say if this was a meeting. The same thing with an email. We tend to go on email duels, if you will, and it would save us all so much time and energy if we just knew when to stop those email chains and actually get on the phone or get a quick conversation together and talk through that. Here's another thing about that, a sidebar, if you will. We end up in way more meetings than we really need or care about. And all of us, we end up multitasking during our meetings. So I'm not suggesting in any way that you create more meetings, but replacing those deadwood meetings with really intentional conversations where you have invested the time to understand the purpose of the meeting, what outcome you would like from it, and then you design your meeting based on that. So conversation design and meeting design is a whole separate topic in itself, but I did want to say that um, when in that example of this, the email chain piece, my suggestion is not to just increase the number of meetings you have, but really being very uh, aware of what is the best mode of conversation given the circumstance, given the situation. What are you really trying to achieve? So, creating opportunities for interactions and being curious and being present in them so that you can learn about the other person and about yourself in the process. And the third step, of course, is rinse and repeat. You've got to keep doing this. Like I said, in the context of inclusive leadership, creating inclusion, creating a sense of belonging. This is not a one and done. You have to be at it. You have to stay intentional. And interrupting unconscious bias is the same thing. Being aware of our biases because we hold so many biases, and it's not a one and done. So always checking with yourself about your thoughts and the stories that you're making up about others, continuing to question the validity of those by it's like a science experiment, yeah. So you're always collecting data on real-time data from your interactions and replace those stories with facts. So that's one way that you can do that. So just to quickly summarize, you know, everybody has unconscious bias. We all we all just are born with it. The key really is to acknowledge that fact and to be courageous enough to admit it, and to be courageous enough to stop when that's happening, when you're getting into that space of creating that story about someone else, interrupting your own bias and doing something different, making that intentional choice to act differently. The second piece is we looked at the impact on the work at the workplace, and particularly in the context of the future of work. And here I would like to mention another thing. I've talked about multi-generational teams and the importance of that in the context of future work in another conversation series. So I did want to bring that back here. A lot of times, and I've seen it. I'm working with a client right now where I'm part of a multi-generational team. The assumptions we make about someone just because they're of a certain age or they're of a certain gender or race or ethnicity, um, we are seeing, so in the context of multi-generational teams, we are seeing people are living longer, so they're working longer. They have way more productive years at work than they used to, let's say in our grandparents' generation, or even my parents' generation, for instance. So we are going to see, and we are seeing more and more millennials and Gen Z, the younger population coming into the workforce, which is a natural cycle, right? So we are seeing already more and more multi-generational teams as well, in addition to multicultural and global teams. So having those stereotypes imprinted in our brains about others, these become barriers to collaborative work, to inclusive work environments. So we kind of took a quick look at that, and then my three-step process, if you will, on interrupting your own biases so that you are able to create that environment that you would like to be a part of, right? So to me, as a self-leadership coach, my focus is always on supporting others in being the leaders they want to see. So you're not waiting for someone to create that environment for you. All change begins with self. Yeah. So in that context, the three-step process is really always be aware of your own thoughts and inner dialogue. The moment you catch yourself creating a story about someone, just stop. And step one, create an opportunity for an actual interaction. Step two, have a courageous, open conversation with a curious mind to learn about them and yourself in the process. And the third step is that you just keep doing it all over again, because you're going to have many, many interactions. You are in different situations on any given day. So there is always opportunity for our unconscious bias to pop up. And so we've got to keep doing this. Um, and That's all I had for today. So if there are any questions or comments, I'll take it in the chat. Otherwise, I would love to hear from you on how you were successful in interrupting your own biases, what kind of stories you're creating about others, how aware are you about of those, and what are you doing about it? So my call to action for you today is uh, in your next interaction, be it at home or at work. I know this session was focused on the workplace, but our biases, we carry them with us. I'm just seeing a question here. What is the advice if you observe unconscious bias? If you observe unconscious bias in others and the impact of that happening in front of you. So if you are a bystander, uh, well, you can choose to transition to being an ally. So you can speak up. An example. So for example, I can go back to when someone commented or remarked that my English was really good. If I wish there was someone else who would have stood up for me to say that it's just another language, right? I do that now for others. So having the courage to speak up for the other person, I think, is one way of dealing with unconscious bias. Now, if your question is around observing that unconscious bias in yourself, then really checking it, asking the question around, okay, is this true? Is this a fact? Have I seen this before as a fact? Or is this something that I have told myself? And creating that opportunity to have an interaction with the other person. So those are two ways I'm looking at it. One is if you happen to be in a place where you are seeing bias, the impact of bias taking place, then be the one to stand up, be that ally for the person experiencing the bias. And if you're trying to interrupt bias on your own, then really asking some of those self-reflection questions and then going from there. I hope that answered the question, Neeraj. I know the chat can take a bit to come through. Cool. Thank you. Yes, so my call to action for you today is to, in your next interaction, observe yourself and see what stories you're making up about others, whoever that you're interacting with. And think about how these stories are serving you. And then think about how you might replace these stories with facts. So that's it for today. So until next month, thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach me on LinkedIn. My website is northstaratwork.com, all one word. And the best place to reach me is LinkedIn or through my website. So thank you very much and see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.